So the New York Knicks back in late June made a blockbuster deal with the Brooklyn Nets for forward Mikal Bridges, and we discussed it on this channel thinking of the trade as the final piece. They had reunited the Villanova boys, the vibes were going to continue from the previous season, and Julius Randle was coming back, and the Knicks were going to be full-on contenders for an NBA championship with a core of Brunson, Randle, Bridges, DiVincenzo, Hart, etc. But just 3 months later, the Knicks actually made the final piece move. And it was the decision to move off of longtime Knick Julius Randle and last season's fan favorite Dante DiVincenzo for the career-long Timberwolf at the time in Karl-Anthony Towns. And it's kind of funny because both Towns and Randle were both seen as guys in similar situations upon their organizations, and the fan bases both kind of had their feelings about both guys. And in whole, those two guys were just not seen as like ideal fits for their teams, alongside with the fact that the contracts that came alongside them were just too much for the bad fit that was coming with that roster and the players. So they both were swapped for each other in one of the biggest trades in both teams' franchise history. And as a Knicks fan myself, I actually liked the trade at the time. And so far in the early season, there's been a lot of flashes as to why I originally loved the trade. Now, obviously, when it went down, both teams' fan bases were crying out the deal. Timberwolves fans didn't want Randle. Knicks fans didn't want Cat. And obviously, to start the season, there's been some mixed reviews. Sometimes it looks ugly watching both teams, but then you see the positives of the trade for both teams. And on the Knicks side of things, I just think it comes from mainly just the overall roster overhaul that they had, trying to piece in two new starters into a team that was mainly Brunson dominant last season, especially after Randle went down. But the main thing I loved about the Cat trade so far was just the newfound spacing for this Knicks team, especially for a guy like Jalen Brunson, who lives in that short mid-range area, lives in the paint with the floaters and all those kinds of things, and he finally has more space in the paint to operate and do Jalen Brunson things. It also opens up those mid-range opportunities for guys like Mikal Bridges and OG Anunoby, who can knock them down at a very high rate. And so far early in the season, we've seen him knock them down pretty efficiently. So you see that. And for years, especially in the Tibbs era, the Knicks have had centers who couldn't shoot and basically were non-factors on the offensive side of the ball, especially with Mitchell Robinson being the starting center. He was literally a non-factor unless he was grabbing offensive rebounds. So teams weren't even factoring them into the game plan at all. But now it's a whole different ball game with Karl-Anthony Towns, who's one of the best offensively skilled centers of all time. Another thing I loved about this trade was the fact that Cat can also play make at his position, which is something we saw from Isaiah Hartenstein last season a lot. But I think it's upgraded with Karl-Anthony Towns, and it opens up so much more opportunity for the Knicks on this end of the floor. Just as a whole, I think they have a really high ceiling to be like a top 3 offensive team in the league in a different kind of way, like an actual good way. I remember 2 years ago, the Knicks were a top 3 offensive team in the league, but it was mainly just off the fact that they grabbed second chance opportunities and got their buckets in that type of fashion, but it wasn't good enough to win in the playoffs when it really got ugly, and it showed when they lost to Miami that season. But it's funny enough, in their most recent game against the Miami Heat, they showed how they can be a top 3 offensive in the league. They finally decided to let the threes fly and look for Cat. Because I don't know what was going on in the first 3 games of the season. I know it's super early and chemistry is a thing. But the Knicks were dead last in 3-point attempts for some reason. And Karl-Anthony Towns only had 6 threes through the first 3 games of the season. And in their most recent game versus Miami, it looked really good. They were looking for him. He was more aggressive on that end of the floor. Brunson was in his playmaking bag. And Bridges also fired away from 3, which was nice to see because he's a great mid-range scorer, but you want to see him get that volume up from downtown, and he did just that. And it showed because they went out there into Miami, and they basically, at the end of that game, said, we are the more talented team. you guys are not on that level offensively, and we're just going to go out there and dominate on that end of the floor at the end of the game and pull this W out. Now, there are some concerns I have with this trade, but I don't think they're like major concerns. I think they're slight concerns, especially with Karl-Anthony Towns' ability to protect the rim, especially when you got used to the Knicks having that 48 minutes of elite rim protection between Hartenstein and Mitchell Robinson. But I think once like Robinson comes back, it'll be a little more improved. Especially even like if Precious Achiuwa comes back soon, it'll be improved. Because right now the center spot outside of Towns can get pretty rough. But I think the Knicks perimeter defense should at least be able to hold them down. As long as Cat is decent on that end of the floor, I can live with like a slight downgrade on that end for a upgrade as an offensive unit. I'll take it, because the Knicks offensively, they like to get into these rock fight, ugly kind of games, and it would be nice to see them become more of like a finesse kind of team, going up and down the court, which still is something they don't do, but I would love to them to, fire away from three and become like a juggernaut on that end of the floor, and I think they really have the talent to do that. Another concern is probably their lack of depth with losing Dante DiVincenzo, because now their bench is like really thin. I mean, if you look at the previous roster they would have had if they didn't trade for Cat, they would have had Hart, DiVincenzo, and Deuce McBride all coming off the bench. Now it's really like 8 guys playing, which is sick, considering that we're in a super early part of the season. But that's something I think I'm going to be concerned about that for a little while, because I don't think Tibbs trusts a lot of these guys coming off the bench, and I kind of don't blame him, but at the same time, you don't want this team to run out of gas come playoff time, and then you have to use the excuse of, oh, well, they were hurt, or they were tired, or they logged a lot of minutes. You don't want those excuses. You want to go into the postseason as fresh as possible so that you can go out there and compete with the best of the best. But as for my overall thoughts, I think the trade was really good, and it's going to take some time to see it fully peak. But once they do, I think the Knicks are going to be easily one of the hardest offenses to guard in the entire NBA. Anyways, that's going to do it. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. This has been a checkup, and I'll see ya in the next video. Peace.